Hello, my friends. Today, I want to share an important conversation I had this morning. I personally spoke with Maria Zakharova, the official spokesperson for President Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. And I can tell you this, she did not hold back. We covered the Russian economy, the war in Ukraine, Western propaganda, and the staggering $200 billion fighter jet deal that Ukraine and the EU are trying to push through. I want to give you the full picture of what she told me, along with what other reporters present heard. The Western claim that Russia is running out of fuel, I asked her directly, and she laughed. I started by asking her about the recurring narrative in Western media that Russia is running out of fuel and its economy is collapsing. This story has been circulating for weeks. Putin's war machine is finally running out of energy. She literally laughed. She called the narrative completely fabricated. She told me Russia has rerouted its energy exports to new partners, China, India, the Middle East. There is no fuel shortage in Russia. No economic collapse, no crisis. Russia has adapted to sanctions faster and more effectively than the West expected. She was honest in saying it has been difficult, but emphasized we are a resilient people. There is no fuel crisis. None of it is true. She also told me something important. People in the West have no idea how massive the sanctions on Russia really are because that information is deliberately hidden from them. And from my own separate sources, I can confirm there are no fuel shortages in Russia. The $200 billion fighter jet deal, I asked her what would happen, and she was blunt. We then moved on to Ukraine's massive fighter jet deal. Zelensky is signing agreements with France and Sweden together, roughly 300 advanced jets. This deal is worth nearly $200 billion. Ukraine doesn't have that kind of money. Europe can't afford it either. Yet the EU is essentially loaning Ukraine money everyone knows will never be repaid. So I asked her directly what these jets mean for the battlefield. Her answer was immediate and cold. Larry, these jets will be destroyed the moment they enter Ukraine, immediately. She repeated it for emphasis. She told me this whole thing is a political stunt, a performance meant to make Western governments look like they are doing something, even though none of it will change the military outcome. She said, this is an existential threat to Russia. No amount of jets will alter the end of this war. And she is right. Russia knows exactly where these jets would land, and Ukraine has almost no surviving air defense capability to protect them. On Russia's economy, she told me the Western narrative is for Western consumption only. I confronted her with the mainstream Western claim that Russia is on the ropes economically. She dismissed it outright. She said, Russia has stabilized domestic industries. Russia has expanded import-export networks with new partners. Russia has adapted to sanctions more efficiently than the West predicted. She stressed that the Russia is collapsing storyline exists solely to justify endless Ukraine spending packages. The West needs its people to believe Russia is desperate so they can keep funneling billions into a failing project. On Ukraine's corruption, I asked her directly, and she didn't hesitate. Last week, we reported that Zelensky's inner circle had been caught stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from U.S. and EU taxpayers. I asked Zakharova about this. She said Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is absolutely correct. Ukraine has become a mafia-style money laundering operation. She described boxes of U.S. dollars and euros wrapped in plastic, cash stuffed into duffel bags inside officials' homes. Luxury villas and cars belonging to Zelensky's top men. Then she used a simple analogy. If you run a fruit market and you have 100 apples and you sell 30, you know how many are left. The US and EU don't count the apples. They have no idea how much money or how many weapons they've poured into Ukraine. None. She told me Americans have no idea this is happening because Western media refuses to talk about it. On peace talks, I asked if Putin has received any framework from the West. Her answer, none. She confirmed that Putin has not received any framework for peace from the European Union or the United States. Not a proposal, not a draft, not even an informal outline, nothing. So this war continues as we head into winter with no Western plan on the table. Final thoughts. Zakharova answered every question directly, something I wish more U.S. politicians would do. She didn't dodge, didn't deflect, didn't give vague talking points. When I asked her about the fighter jets going to Ukraine, she didn't sugarcoat anything. They will be destroyed immediately. And when discussing U.S. involvement or NATO's role, she was equally clear. This is an existential threat to us. The West should not expect us to react differently than you would if someone sent 150 fighter jets into Mexico. And good, it's long overdue. This conflict should never have begun, not in 2022, not in 2014, not any time after NATO spent 20 years creeping toward Russia's borders, ignoring every red line Moscow publicly drew, and now, 11 years later, we're staring at a casualty count straight out of World War I. 1 million Ukrainians dead, hundreds of thousands wounded or maimed, 9 million now living abroad, mainly in Europe, many of whom will never return. Nearly 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers deserted, tens of thousands captured. This is what a country looks like when it's been fed deliberately into a geopolitical meat grinder. Ukraine has been bleeding out trench by trench, drone strike by drone strike, missile barrage by missile barrage. Russia has systematically dismantled Ukraine's air defenses, its power grid, its command centers. The lights went out in Ukraine long before the corruption scandals exploded into public view. And make no mistake, those corruption revelations aren't Russian propaganda. They're now echoed by outlets like the Financial Times, The Economist, The Spectator, The Washington Post, and the New York Times, the same institutions that once screamed that anyone who mentioned Ukrainian corruption was repeating Putin talking points. They admit what some of us said years ago. Ukraine was the most corrupt country in Europe even before the war started. And war turned corruption into an industry. Weapons, cash, aid, hundreds of billions were poured into Ukraine with no audit trail, no accounting, no oversight. Shrink-wrapped dollars leaving Western capitals and arriving in black Mercedes trunks before disappearing into villas, offshore accounts, and luxury lifestyles. While ordinary Ukrainians freeze in dark apartments, the political class in Kiev was siphoning U.S. and EU money at industrial scale. Now the storm is arriving at their door. The head of Zelensky's presidential office, according to reliable Ukrainian sources, has an arrest warrant pending 72 hours, give or take. And if his closest aide is going down, Zelensky himself can't be far behind. Washington, under Trump's renewed pressure, is finally forcing Kyiv's internal anti-corruption bureau to act. And once the first domino falls, others follow fast. Some of us warned this would happen. We were ridiculed, but we were right. As for the war itself, Trump is tired of the European lapdogs yapping for World War III, tired of being pushed toward a NATO-Russia showdown that would end civilization in a thermonuclear flash, tired of Washington's war machine pretending Ukraine can win something it lost years ago. NATO versus Russia is not a war. It is suicide. Trump understands that, even if the bipartisan war lobby pretends not to. And now, with Washington pulling the plug quietly but decisively, Kyiv is running out of money, out of weapons, out of manpower, out of time, and out of political protection. Which brings us back to the alleged 28-point plan. If the leaks are accurate, the plan includes complete Ukrainian withdrawal from all remaining territory in Donbass, recognition of Crimea and Donbass as part of the Russian Federation, a Ukrainian military cut by half, constitutional guarantees of Ukrainian neutrality, a permanent bar on NATO troops or membership. If those terms sound familiar, it's because Russia has repeated them since 2014. These were always the minimum conditions for peace. Washington rejected them and Ukraine paid the price. Too many Ukrainians have died. Too many Western taxpayers have been robbed. A negotiated and quiet, discreet, away from the cameras was always the only realistic path. And if that's what's finally happening, then yes, sing hallelujah, because peace bought with truth is better than war maintained with lies. Now, before I bring in Chris Hedges, who understands the instincts of empire as well as any living journalist, let me pivot to something else shaking American politics. The Epstein files. The White House misled the public. Influencers were handed empty binders. Certain officials claimed the files didn't exist, then claimed they never had them, then insisted the whole scandal was a Democratic hoax. Trump's shifting positions triggered an earthquake inside his own political base. Marjorie Taylor Greene, once his most loyal foot soldier, now publicly humiliated. Thomas Massie attacked. Rand Paul mocked in writing with Senator, put in sarcastic quotation marks. Trump calls them traitors, but the truth is simpler. The real betrayal came from the man who promised transparency and delivered none. He promised to drain the swamp. He promised accountability. He promised to expose corruption. He promised to reveal election interference. He promised to release the Epstein files. But when push came to shove, the deep state he vowed to fight is the very structure now shielding him on Epstein, on intelligence operations, and on foreign policy reversals. And even his own followers are beginning to see it. Finally, Venezuela, Nigeria, new wars looming, and Trump's reckless rhetoric about military action in places most Americans cannot find on a map. I'll break all of that down, but now, as promised, I'll turn to Chris Hedges, the man who should have been shaping U.S. foreign policy decades ago. Stay tuned. I've said many times that if there were any sanity left in Washington, someone like Chris Hedges would be running American foreign policy. Pulitzer Prize winner, former New York Times bureau chief in the Middle East, there isn't much about international politics he doesn't understand. Let me walk you through how I see what he and others are circling around right now, and I'll speak plainly, in my own voice. The 28-point plan and the smell of a deal. I was on the same face, the press call with Maria Zakharova that a number of journalists joined. She officially denied any knowledge of a 28-point peace plan between Washington and Moscow. On paper, that's the line. But when you look at the signals, it's hard to believe nothing is happening. Peskov refused to kill the story. He just repeated that Russia stands by the Anchorage principles. Key Ukrainian leadership is suddenly out of the country on diplomatic trips, but the timing is curious. Western leaks are talking about as soon as a week for a potential deal. Something is clearly moving behind the scenes. If there's a 28-point document, it likely looks similar to what Russia has been demanding from day one, and frankly since 2014. Full withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from all of Donbass, including the pockets they still hold under siege. A drastic reduction in Ukrainian armed forces. No NATO in Ukraine and no Ukraine in NATO. International recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea and Donbass. Moscow could live with that. These are not new Russian positions. They've been warning about NATO expansion for decades. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin all sent the same signal. Ukraine in NATO is a red line no Russian leadership can accept. William Burns, now CIA director, wrote exactly that in a cable years ago. Ukraine in NATO is Niet means Niet territory for Moscow. Everyone in the system knew this. The tragedy is that all of this land for peace, neutrality, constitutional guarantees could have been put on the table before the war started. Even Henry Kissinger, of all people, said this would end with some kind of land for peace arrangement. He was right about that, however criminal his own record is. Washington wanted a proxy war instead, using Ukraine to bleed Russia and isolate Putin. That's what this war has always been about from the U.S. side, degrading Russia, not defending democracy, and it was always going to end at a negotiating table. How Washington might swallow a Russian win. If Trump, back in the White House, accepts a deal that basically codifies a Russian victory on the battlefield, how does that play in Washington? Congress, I doubt they block it. Ukraine has always had more resistance on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. The Democrats are now the primary war party in practice. The liberal media has sold Ukraine as a holy crusade for nearly 3 years. They'll scream, editorialize, and cry betrayal. But that doesn't mean they can stop it. We just saw something different over the Epstein files there. Republicans broke with Trump to force transparency. Ukraine is politically different. It doesn't cut as close to home as child abuse does. So, ugly as it is, a deal that admits reality might actually get through the system simply because the war is clearly lost and everyone in power knows it. NATO out of Ukraine and the emerging order. Strategically, the single most important element is simple: keep NATO out of Ukraine. From the Russian point of view, that's existential. They've been invaded multiple times across Ukrainian territory: Napoleon, World War I, World War II. The memory is not theoretical for them. Back at German reunification, US and German officials implied verbally that NATO would not expand 1 inch east of a unified Germany. That promise was quietly broken, step by step. Russia watched every step, and this war is the inevitable consequence of that broken understanding. If this new deal really locks in a neutral Ukraine, no, NATO forward basing, recognition of Russia's gains, then we're looking at a decisive shift in the world order. It strengthens BRICS, SCO, and the broader non-Western alignment. It signals that Russia can't be broken by sanctions, proxy wars, or information warfare. It accelerates the move toward a multipolar system where Washington no longer dictates the rules unilaterally. It also opens the door down the line to a future reconciliation between Russia and parts of Europe, especially Germany. That historically has been a powerful axis economically and strategically. The old monster wakes up again. On Germany, I share a deep unease. We're watching open talk of Germany building the most powerful army in Europe. A resurgence of militaristic imagery, billboards recruiting for the armed forces, flags everywhere, public rhetoric about responsibility and leadership, familiar mood in the political culture. A normalization of German military hegemony in Europe. Every time Germany has reached military primacy on the continent, it has ended badly for Europe and the world. Reunification, followed by rearmament and constant pressure on Russia, was always a dangerous cocktail. You were right to be wary of a reunified, heavily armed Germany. The current trajectory vindicates that fear. Not an invasion, but a bombing campaign switching to Venezuela. An American ground invasion is unlikely. The political and logistical cost would be enormous. A sustained bombing campaign, however, that is very plausible. We've seen this movie before. Clinton versus Iraq. Years of airstrikes, infrastructure smashed, the population punished, regime change hoped for, but never actually achieved by bombing alone. Israel against Iran, a belief that strikes alone will trigger collapse. It doesn't work that way. My fear is that Venezuela gets Iraq treatment from the air power stations, refineries, government buildings based on the illusion that bombing will break the state. It won't. It will just create more chaos and suffering. Gaza, the UN, and the Arab Street. On Gaza, the latest so-called peace plan pushed through the UN Security Council is a disgrace. It's essentially a 19th century colonial arrangement installing a kind of viceroy, rewarding the party that committed the massacres. It violates core principles of international law. It abandons the Palestinians after 2 years of what many legal scholars now openly call genocide. Russia and China abstained instead of vetoing. They didn't support the plan, but they didn't block it either. Zakharova's explanation was roughly this: the Arab governments, every capital, including the weak Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, were on board. Moscow put forward its own alternative plan, which was shot down. Russia didn't want to stand alone against a united Arab diplomatic front and risk losing influence in the region. I understand the logic, but let's be honest about the reality. Many Arab regimes are complicit in the destruction of Gaza through silence, normalization, and continued logistics and trade. On the Arab street, it's the opposite. The anger is volcanic. On the ground, in Amman, Cairo, Ramallah, Doha, you hear chants like, "We are all Hamas." The land bridge supplying Israel via UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan is running. Truck convoys roll across the King Hussein Bridge. A journalist who exposed Jordanian companies participating in this resupply was jailed for doing his job. Egypt and Jordan have not severed diplomatic relations with Israel. Egypt merely recalled its ambassador. These regimes are fragile, widely hated, and reliant on repression and external support. If Israel succeeds in pushing Palestinians into northern Sinai, it could genuinely threaten the survival of Sisi's government. Jordan's monarchy is not politically bulletproof either. So while Russia and China may be calibrating their moves to avoid alienating Arab capitals, they're also tying themselves, at least tactically, to regimes that are standing against the moral instincts of their own populations. Epstein Files, Trump and the Revolt in the GOP. Now, about the Epstein Files, this is one of the rare issues where Republicans broke with Trump and forced his hand. Trump tried to block or delay release. The Republican rank and file in Congress balked. The optics were simply too toxic. What we know and don't know, there are long-standing allegations, not proven facts in court, but detailed claims linking Trump to Epstein's world. Photographs over the years with Epstein and young women. A 2016 civil complaint in California by a woman under a pseudonym alleging she was raped by Trump and Epstein when she was a minor. That case was withdrawn and never tested in court, but the accusations are on record. When the FBI raided Epstein's Manhattan residence, they reportedly found a safe full of tapes and CDs. Epstein had a habit of recording encounters. Labels allegedly listed girls' names. The men's names were redacted in court filings. Journalists and writers like Michael Wolff have claimed to have seen images of Trump with very young women in Epstein's orbit. Again, that's reported, not adjudicated, but it adds weight to the suspicion. How much of this will see daylight in unredacted form is an open question. Expect a lot of black ink. There will be enormous pressure to protect powerful people on both sides of the aisle in finance, media, intelligence, and foreign governments. But here's why the Republican revolt on this issue matters. Sexual abuse, especially of children, is not an abstract geopolitical matter. The percentage of Americans who have experienced sexual abuse or molestation is disturbingly high. Blocking the Epstein files would have looked like an attempt to bury the crimes of an elite pedophile network. Even among cynical politicians, there are lines that can't be crossed without triggering a backlash. On this, the GOP base and many lawmakers simply refuse to carry Trump's water. So, to sum up in my own voice, in Ukraine, Washington is stumbling toward admitting reality under the cover of a 28-point plan. In Europe, German rearmament and NATO's eastward creep continue to destabilize the continent. In Venezuela, the temptation for an air campaign is real and dangerous. In Gaza, the UN has just rubber-stamped a colonial non-solution. And in the United States, the Epstein files threaten to expose just how deep elite criminality runs, possibly touching Trump himself.